thinking about self-publishing and don't know where to start? Join the Spa Girls each week for 30 minutes of honest advice, tips and resources. I'm Trudy J and I am here with Wendy Vella.
Hello.
Cheryl Phipps.
Hi there.
And Shah Barrett.
Hi.
Hello. So this week we are talking about understanding your character's wounds. I wanted to call it exposing your character's wounds.
And
no one would let me.
No.
It sounded too graphic.
Exposing them,
cutting them open and looking inside.
No.
Okay, so none of that. All right, so your character's wound. So basically it's a fairly basic premise of when you're writing a book, you kind of have a wound that your character has that they kind of, it's part of their arc usually. I don't know, maybe there's examples of where you wouldn't have a wound, probably, I don't know. But in this case, we're talking about characters who have wounds. I don't know, I can't think off the top of my head of someone who might not want a wound. I don't know.
We're talking internal, like within the psyche.
Like they haven't got
not a severed limb. No severed limbs.
They've got issues, all right?
They've got internal issues. It's part of their internal.
All right. Yeah. We've all got
They're
issues.
not the only ones with issues.
We've got issues.
So another highly professional episode of Spa Girls podcast is off to an awesome start. Okay, so we wanted to talk about how you figure out what the wound might be and then how you might show that wound in the book. So one of the first ways to look at potential wounds, or we've got there is a book starting with. Should we start with the book?
Yeah.
The book that is probably quite well known to you, hopefully, maybe, because it's part of a series. It's Emotional Wound Thesaurus. I'm holding it up for people who are watching on YouTube. And it is basically all about the different kinds of wounds that you could possibly give your character.
Who wrote that?
By
Who wrote that,
Anonymous. Angela Ackerman and Becca Puglisi. I'm sorry, Rebecca Puglisi.
That word.
They've written a number of those Thesauruses writers, and they're really highly recommended.
They've got a bazillion, haven't they?
Yeah.
A bazillion of those.
Yeah, and they have a website. I think it's called www.onestopforwriters.com. It could be, yeah. I'm hoping that's them, and I haven't just given. But then, if it's not them, it's another place that has really good information.
But we'll put it in the show notes. We'll put it in the show notes.
Oh,
anyway, and that these are all resources that you can use to try and figure out what kind of wound that you might give your character that they have to kind of work with throughout the book. And so some of the examples of wounds that you could use that they give in the book and on the website start off with identifying someone who could have hurt them. Like it could be something that happened to them as a child usually, or like Lisa Cron says it has to happen before you're 15 or 13, something like that. So it has to be something generally childhood trauma maybe.
Should we talk about why our characters need wounds?
Yes. Okay, let's talk about that. Go share.
Well, to find out how your character works, you know, how they're going to fit into the story, there has to be something about them that's worthy of a story. And I guess what we're looking for is a way to make them flawed and then follow their journey into some sort of redemption and using that flaw to make a positive statement or to overcome it.
Yeah.
Boring people
right?
make for boring stories, basically.
Yeah, exactly.
Or perfect people make for boring stories, don't they?
Yeah, and so for example, if your childhood, I'm looking at the Thesaurus book, and if you're raised by an addict or something, so if your mother was some kind of addict and you're raised by them, you might have an emotional wound that made you react in a certain, like you might be that you weren't worthy of love or something like that, and it was that might be your wound, and then the story is around you learning that you are worthy of love. So the wound creates the story and the arc. And if you don't have a wound, then you kind of don't have any internal conflict, or so that person who doesn't feel like they're worthy of being loved has to go up against in plot situations or against other characters where he's going to say, I'm not worthy of being loved, so I'm not going to put myself out there in this situation. I'm not worthy of love, so therefore I'm just going to have one night stands. I don't want to get into a relationship. I'm not worthy of love. I'm not going to be friendly with people or whatever it is. So it creates the story almost. And if so that's kind of anything else to add.
I could see people actually starting, like if you're like as a starting point actually for plotting something, you know, just as a different angle, you could use it that way.
Oh yeah, 100%. Yeah, no, definitely. And that is a great way to start plotting, actually, like, because it writes itself almost. It's like, you know, the character and what their wound is, and then you like the character might be afraid of clowns. That's not a good wound, by the way, but if they're afraid of clowns, then in somewhere in the story they have to come up against a clown, right? So it creates the plot rather than it being a different, like, you know, like if you character-based story, you kind of use those to find the story and create where it comes from. So if you identify who hurt them, so this is in this particular situation, it would be someone who, like, it might be a parent, or it might be, and it's not necessarily physically, although it could be, but it's someone who taught them something that has created a belief in them, that they have this misbelief. Yeah, that's something from Lisa Cron, actually. She talks about having a misbelief, and she talks about this as well. And the wound is also something that Michael Haig talks about. This is something that often story structure people do talk about. The wound. It's quite an important part of storytelling. So
yeah, and just shout out to us, because we did a really, really good podcast episode with Lisa Cron that we'll link to in the show notes. But just go to our website or go onto your podcast app and search Lisa Cron on Spa Girls. Really, really, she's amazing.
Awesome. I love her.
So good.
Really good.
So then another way to find, another place to find wound is look at negative events that might have shaped them. So you know, parents might have died in a car crash, or older brother was always bullying them, or give me other examples here, people. Some other events.
I mean, I think, you know, you could have had a happy life up until the age of 10, and then your parents died, and then you were forced to live in a foster home or with an aunt who you didn't love, you know, so that would instantly change your perception of life, of everything that you thought. It's completely, I think, you know, having parents that have told you useless your entire life, you know, that's gonna form you, you know, into the, you know, someone who doesn't believe that they've got any self-worth.
And this is just something that occurred to me. So, for example, in a romance, you've got the male and then female, or male and male, or female and female. You've got the two people, and they both need a wound. Generally, like it makes for better, and it kind of needs to be a wound that kind of is almost. When I say complimentary, I don't mean that they should, but it's like if someone has I just remember someone talking about it and saying this person was raised by an addict. The guy was raised by an addict, so he's very anti-alcohol. With the main woman was an addict, like a recovering addict. And it was kind of like falling into. So she had her own things, but it was almost like right into his misbelief that she fell in. You know, like it triggered him in every way. And that would be a really hard book to write, by the way. I'm scared by the idea of that. But you know, like
it's the control freak and the one who's an absolute mess. You know, like there's the push and pull the whole time. You know,
and maybe the couple where one of them is always being left, you know, or they have this perception that they've always been left behind, and they fall for somebody who's like you know, never with the same partner for more than 5 minutes, you know, and they fall for each other, but how can that possibly work? Something like that.
The younger sibling who's always been told that the older sibling's a superstar, you know, there's so many different things that you know, you get that you can use along the way.
So the next option is defining their biggest mistake or failure. So this is something that the person did to themselves. Like, so there was something that happened. They didn't win the Little League contest when their parents told them they could. So maybe they're a failure and they can never do anything right. Or, you know, like there's something that happened to them that was wholly theirs and not an event or a person external to them that created some kind of wound in them. So they might have felt embarrassed. There might have been like something happened to them at high school where they embarrassed themselves completely, and now they can't risk anything.
They put themselves out there, you know, to do something, a recital or something like that, and it all just went horribly wrong. So they decided they're going to retreat and never do it again. So you retreat into themselves, and so that's a person hiding from the world. Another one is finding the lie.
So this is an intriguing one. So, and I think this is kind of the misbelief as well that Lisa Cron talks about, like looking for, so maybe something happens and then they believe something that's untrue about themselves or about the world. So, yeah.
Somebody stops something from happening, like a crime or something, and accidentally they end up killing somebody because they've hit them too hard, or because they've been protecting somebody else, and suddenly they go to jail or whatever, they go to court, and then now, because they have killed somebody, they're unworthy of anybody wanting to love them, because bad things happen when you're around, something like that.
Yeah. So that would be the lie. Yeah. It's amazing how we're able to think up these things right off the cuff. I'm quite impressed.
Yeah. We have been writing for quite a few years, though, to be fair, haven't we?
We do have quite active imagination.
Also, we've been reading for probably longer. And you
that is
start
true.
recognizing
Absolutely,
these things, and look at all the fairy tales. Look at the wounds in there, man.
I know.
Yeah.
I'm just thinking. I was just chuckling. We were talking about Orphans, because it was it was such a trope for the Harlequins in the 70s and 80s when I was well into reading them, and it was pretty much everybody was an orphan in those books. I get it, because then you don't have to deal with like family cast when you've got a set shorter.
But it also has something romantic about being an orphan. Like it sounds terrible, right? Because it's horrible. No, but it's not romantic. But actually, there is this kind of like poor, sad little orphan who's had this tough life, and now they're kind of getting the happy ever after, and it's all coming right, kind of thing. And there's I
blame Charles Dickens. So
he started it all, didn't he?
Oliver.
I have some more, please. So another one is like people are only nice when they want something from you, or
because you're rich. And they just see you as a meal ticket, so they don't actually know you. They'll never see you.
They've not taken the time.
So all of these kinds of things are finding the lie that the person is telling themselves. And then this is a good one, know what they fear most. So this is the clowns. You fear the clown the most, then you know that the clown has to be the thing that comes into the story. Or if they fear falling in love because they witnessed their mother falling in love all the time and she was always getting hurt, and so they think that love is the enemy and they don't want to fall in love, and then they fall in love, like it's their worst fear.
Scared of being vulnerable.
Many years ago, Donald Mast, the agent, came to Romance Writers of New Zealand, and he did a workshop. And one of his points that I remember really clearly was identify the thing that the character wouldn't do, which would go to the wound. He didn't use the word wound, I don't think, but it was like write down the one thing that they would never ever do, and then make them do it, and it kind of goes to that. So it just deepens the character. Doesn't it?
Yeah, and it's, or I've heard it in a similar vein, but it's the what's the thing that the character would most hate to have happen. So the thing that they would absolutely just hate having happen, and have that happen to them almost, like. So it's a sort of different take on the same thing, but yeah.
I mean, if you're writing a book and you think that it's going too well, it's usually because you haven't. They haven't got enough flaws, or they haven't got, so you've got to go, oh, well, actually, I need to make him a little less likable, or I need to, that sort of thing. And I think that quite often with a character, for me, if a character's not working, then there's an issue with their backstory, or what they stand for, or what their beliefs are, or something like that.
They can't be perfect.
No, and you don't have to make them horrible, because there has to be a redeeming factor. Like if they've just been horrible to someone and walked down the road and bent down and patted a fluffy bunny, you know what I mean? There's got to be a redeeming, because this bunny's just walking down the road. You know what I'm saying, though? Or he comes up and he sees an elderly lady on the thing, and he's like, oh, come on, I'll help you across, take my arm. What I'm trying to say is there's got to be a redeeming character to the flaw.
What you would do, though, is you would say he's being a complete horrible person to whoever, like presumably the heroine, but you have it in his backstory, or we know as the reader that the reason What?
I said a-hole. Sorry.
Stop it.
Don't
but-
interrupt her.
Sorry.
I'm on flow here, people. I'm on flow.
Go, flow.
But we know as the reader that the only reason he's being mean to her is because of something to do with his flaw, like he's actually secretly in love with her and has been his entire life, and she's ignored him and been a complete, like whatever. Then we kind of, it's okay. Like it's okay that he's a complete, or we learn that later, even like the start of the book, he's a complete.
Yeah.
But as you go through the book, you learn that it's because he's afraid of frogs, and it kind of makes it all better. Like whatever the reason is, so that's the reason
who's not afraid of frogs.
And the reason you have the wound is so that you can explain the actions, and when they are doing things that are incomprehensible, like being a complete then it's okay. It kind of we accept that and we go, he's actually secretly a nice guy because he picked up that book off the road.
Oh, no wonder he's like that.
But also he got rejected by his mother and he loves bunnies. So like it's all part of the same.
That's where backstory comes in, right?
Yeah.
It's all the backstory, but just don't dump it in there, people.
Yeah, we're not talking about info dumps. We're
just talking about him seeing something and it triggering, or a memory, or something like that. Just don't write this long convoluted thing.
That's talking to how you reveal the wound.
Which is
it's all very well you knowing it, but you've got to convey it to the reader, don't you?
So you've got this wound, you've figured out the backstory of the two main characters, if it's a romance, and you know how they're going to work in together, and how it's kind of like, it's almost like you find I don't know how it works for you guys, but like you might figure out the one main character, or the one, whether it's whoever it is, and then you use that to kind of create the wound in the other person, because it's kind of like a matching or kind of complementary wound, and then you can work from there. Is that kind of, no? You're looking at me blankly. No, not at all. Okay, so how would you decide the wounds on your characters, just as a little insight into
how do you decide the wounds?
Like, do you do it as you're writing, you figure out what their story is?
An incident that creates the wound, or creates the illusion of what the wound could be, and then find the backstory, why that happened, why that made him like that, to do that thing, or And I think
usually quite often it happens when they're meeting the hero or heroine for the first time. There's usually something there, that there's a conflict there, because obviously we don't want them falling into each other's and declaring undying love straight up. But there's
that first chapter.
No, but
let's find out that they're meeting.
I try to get them together as soon as I can, and there's usually an issue, like he's got protective issues, he couldn't protect someone, and he wants to protect her, and she's like, back away, buddy, there's that's for me how I do it.
So an overprotective dude ends up with an independent woman who can't or whatever. So it is something that they can kind of knuckle up against each other and kind of fight over, and both of them, by getting together, learn something. Like her independent thing will be from a wound as well, right? So maybe she had to be independent because her parents died, and she had to learn from an early age how to look after herself, and now she can't be the thought of anyone helping her at all. Well, she needs to learn how to take a little bit of help.
Well, that's it. They control their lives by doing that, don't they?
And he's overprotective because he couldn't protect someone else who died, and now he feels that he has to protect everyone, and he has to learn to back off, and that's how it connects together, right? That's kind of what I'm trying to say. Like there needs to be some kind of connection between them, so that each of their wounds is, they're not separately off having their own separate journeys, and then
there's got to be a connection, and that's where the friction comes. Because of the push and pull, because they're meeting each other, these forces, and he's got his beliefs, she's got hers, and they're opposites, so bam 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 until they can work it out.
But I would say that's the conflict between them. But beneath that conflict, driving that conflict is the character wound. And you might not necessarily know that at the start. So that could come out maybe as you write, like reveal to yourself.
Mhm.
You can start off with that kind of external conflict, but it's the internal that really is driven by the character wound. So
I mean, it depends.
I
who you
guess-
write. Like you would want to,
yeah, that's it.
like
There's probably different
if you
ways.
knew the wound to begin with, then you could use the wound to create the scenarios and plot it out, or it could be something that reveals itself to you as you write, and you
Yeah.
figure out why precisely they are like they are. Lisa Cron, again, my hero, she talks about creating, writing the scene, where it happened. Like there might be some specific scene in their past where they learned this one thing that kind of makes them believe a certain way. And once you've got that scene, then that can kind of help you create the flow of the rest of the book, because you kind of know where it came from. So yeah. So let's talk about how you get this across in your story. Like we've talked about that opening scene of the conflict between the two characters, and we've talked a little bit, we mentioned backstory just briefly. So how do you weave in backstory without being info dumpy? Question?
Well, show don't tell, as Cher said. You know, you've got to, you know, I mean, it is quite a hard, it's just something that you learn over time. To actually explain it out loud is not easy, to be honest.
You could do it in several ways. Like you could be having a conversation about something, and you know they're suddenly thinking, no, that's not how it looked for me, it was like this. Or you know, something triggers a memory.
Triggers,
or just they're having an argument about something, and
or going back to the environment that it incurred at.
Yes,
you know, like taking them back to the house, or whatever, or the lake they fell in, and you
the
know,
graveside.
Graveside, and he's like, oh, I'm all good with this, or she's like, I'm all good with this, and as soon as they get there, boom, they're back there, right back into where they were. You know,
so the trigger is an interesting one, because you could also do things like, so we've got an overprotective man and the independent woman. You could have the independent woman doing something dangerous that puts him right into the mode of I've got to be overprotective, and suddenly he's being crazy and being all overprotective, and then she, you know, like so that kind of thing automatically shows how he gets in, when he's in that mode, and how she reacts, and creates a so and anything
even though I'm attracted to him, I can't have him telling me what to do. I can't, you know, that's just not
so
for
her
me.
trigger is having someone telling her what to do when she doesn't need that, because she's survived on her own or whatever.
And he wants a commitment from her, and she's not going to give it because she's sworn she's not going to ever marry till she's 40, you know, like there's so many, because that's what she promised her mother, or you know, there's so many different push pull, isn't there forces that keep them apart and create that conflict.
So as soon as you have the wound, then you can start writing a big list of triggers, things that might trigger that person to kind of act badly or react in a way that you don't want them to react, and then maybe use that to figure out how maybe something's going to trigger something, and then they learn a lesson around it. Like they learn that maybe it's not they don't need to be triggered by that, like what event might cause them to kind of learn that actually maybe this woman is perfectly capable of taking care of herself, and maybe I don't need to act like that, overprotective, and think of those kinds of scenes, and suddenly you start populating your book with all these different scenes related to the wound.
And I think at the beginning of the book you're validating why they feel the way they do, and making them wrong for feeling the way they do, but then as the book progresses you see the change and
the growth.
The growth and the acceptance in the end that how they perceive things is actually not how things are, or how they could be better, they could be different. They, you know, there is a promise, or you know, the ability for things to change.
Overcoming.
Yes.
But just what you said then, Cher, that's another way to reveal the wound, which is how they perceive things. So it's from the character's perspective, whether you're writing third person or first person, how they see we're all of us perceive things in different ways. How the character perceives something, whether it's a snub at a ball if you're running Regency or whatever, or a perceived snub, or that conveys their wound as well, you know, because you've got somebody with a different wound wouldn't have seen that same snub in the same way, kind of thing. So that's a big
and it's interesting, like when you get a book that's gone deep into a biased perspective like that, like the kind of what's the curious incident of the dog in the nighttime, Have you anyone read that? No. And he's
it's
a while since I read it. I did enjoy it, but it was like a character. I think he's autistic. I think that's the point. And he was talking about finding out what had happened, through this story. But it was the whole time, that you're reading from a perspective of someone who has a view of the world, and it's quite fascinating. So if we're talking about a Regency novel where you've got this cynical Duke who's been hurt in love, and he's watched his dissolute parents hate each other their whole life, and then he sees some young girl coming up to him, and all he can see is some little miss who's trying to catch him on the marriage mart or whatever, he sees her in a negative light because that's all he's seen, and that's his perspective. And then you go into her perspective, and she's just like, wow, he's amazing, he's this beautiful Duke. And then he gives her the set down, and then it's all about the perspective. It's all about how it's seen from the different people's, you can create some, like, I love when they do people who are like, when you think it through and you go, okay, this person, like I've been reading Susan Elizabeth Phillips books recently, and the Chicago Stars. I'm rereading them. I've all read them all before, but I'm rereading them. And these guys are football players, and so she has often woven into the story. It's kind of like they use football analogies to understand stuff. So they'll be like, I don't even know, because I don't know football, but I didn't make it to the 40-yard line with this comment or whatever, or I did the hard yards. It's like casually thrown in, not in a really obvious way. Just these guys, spend all the time exercising. They're obsessed with the game of football, so that and the way he thinks is,
like
it's
a
all
football
about the
game.
football. So he uses football terminology to understand the rest of his life.
But I think the supporting cast too, it can also play a part in that, especially if you're writing series. Like if you think about the characters who have been through their books and they know this character, and they can then be part of showing us exactly why he's like he is, because they can bring up incidents and, hey bud, why are you doing that, we know what you went through, rah, rah, rah. So it's all part of it as well. The supporting cast is massive.
That supporting cast is really, really important. Like, they're not just people randomly inserted. They're going to be people who can actually help with the characterization around them. Totally. So what else are there? What the choices they make
in a
monologue?
Okay, in a monologue. All right.
It's a biggie.
And I think it's the same.
Have the heroine looking in the mirror, lamenting her gorgeous blonde looks and how nobody takes her seriously. But in a monologue, in general, is a way of conveying.
Looking at the water, there's, I'm not going back in there. I'm not going back in there. That just telling himself why he's not going back in there. There's so many different things. I'm not eating that. I watched grandma choke on that, or whatever. It's just, it can be going on inside their heads.
And the inner monologue is kind of attached to the biased perspective, right? Because it's right inside their head. It's actually an awesome way. It's completely probably the closest you can get to inside the person's head, right? So it's very close. And as readers, what we're doing is we want to be right inside that person's head, right? Like we want to be a part of that person and seeing and understanding how they think. So inner monologue is awesome. Like it tells you so much. It gives you the ability to tell so much about those characters and why they're doing stuff. And
takes away he said, she said.
Exactly. And the last one I have here is choices that they make. So they choose to do things a certain way, and thereby show their wound, right? My mum has just walked into the background of the thing. Wave, Mum. Anyway,
so true. It's, it is very much that the choices,
and that's a big part. Like when you think about actually our choices that we make show a big part of our character, like who we are and why we do stuff. Like if we're afraid of clowns, we don't go to the circus. If we are
all sorts of things, like if we're a leader, if there's 5 of us standing there and someone takes the lead, what does that tell you about that person? Oh, they're quite strong, they like to be in control, rah, rah, rah. People that hang back, why do they hang back? What's happened in their life that have they been one of 10 children and they've been the youngest? And there's so many different things you can get from the way your character behaves.
Like why do they do the job that they do? How did they come to that? Why do they relate to other people in the way that they do?
No worries. Cool.
So,
Excellent. I
So
think we've probably
basically,
covered
we're
off a
going to
lot
have
of that.
these most amazing, well-rounded, developed characters
Yeah.
exactly.
as
Excellent.
a
Exactly.
result.
Perfect.
Yes. All
I
right.
think we
Well, I
just
think-
nailed it out of
recommend-
the park.
Highly recommend that book, the,
Yeah.
the Emotional Thesaurus.
Thesaurus.
Yep.
Emotional Wound Thesaurus, I should say.
Yeah.
And also, like I said, a shout out to our podcast episode with Lisa Cron, but it was her
Yeah.
Story Genius book that she
Yeah.
really,
Yeah.
Cool.
yeah.
She's got several
Awesome.
books now. All right. Well, so where can we be found?
We can be found at spygirlspodcast.com, and come along and drop us a comment, drop us a review too. That would be really awesome.
Mhm.
Awesome.
We'd really
Awesome.
Okay, so thank
Okay.
you all for listening to another episode of the Spa Girls podcast. We will be back again next week, same time, same place. I eat all the time, all the
Bye.
places.
Bye.
But for now, bye.
Bye.